The reason is that it's difficult material, and some of the thought is not completely mature yet. I've been working on some of it for quite a few years, but some of it isn't mature, so there may be some difficulty. In these talks, we're trying to explore, via the Rosicrucian philosophy, consciousness and unconsciousness, so that we can understand that reality better and so that we can live better. Tonight will be a little bit more theoretical than all of the other talks, but there will be a few very practical things in it. Now, yesterday we just introduced the subject of unconsciousness, and we discussed it relative to consciousness as had been covered a few years ago. Now, some of those fundamentals were of great importance, and they're going to be the starting point for this talk. So there'll be a little bit of repetition, and the repetition is good if for no other reason to establish an organized vital body. One of the fundamentals that we discussed last evening was that consciousness seemed to be a reasonable description of part of the absolute. In this waking consciousness and unconsciousness are two different states of what could be called general consciousness. It's all one thing. But as soon as we start pondering this, we encounter things that are very difficult to understand, mostly because we have a very earthy, materialistic consciousness. And we're used to concrete things, things that have a beginning and things that have an end. We're not used to timeless things, and we're not used to boundless things. The greatest of human minds, such as Kurt Gödel, the great logician, mentally understand that there is truth that is beyond logic, and there is truth that is beyond the mind. But when they try to enter it, they're not prepared. They're not psychologically or spiritually prepared, and they have difficulties. In fact, Kurt Gödel, when he got to that deep of a level of consciousness, basically almost flipped out. So what we're talking about are very transcendent things that you can get yourself into trouble if you aren't prepared. The Buddhists, when they speak about truth that transcends the mind, they find it to be ineffable, which means you can't talk about it. So what they do is they call it the void. But when they call it the void, they don't call it the void because it's empty. They call it the void because it is void of any definite condition. And that's a good way to do it, because really it is unconditioned and unconditional love. Love of the life spirit. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy has equally remarkable things to say about consciousness. But in the Rosicrucian philosophy, the emphasis is on practical things rather than metaphysical things. The metaphysical things are there to satisfy our minds and to give us something to keep us busy, to keep us off the streets, so that we can grow by doing simple things. Now, the idea is that if we are given simple statements of truth, and we live by them, we'll be able to get to all of the abstruse truths anyway. So what we want is self-reliance, and testable first-hand consciousness, things that we can experience. The Rosicrucian Fellowship is for the purpose of developing people to have direct spiritual experience. We're being trained to, as soon as possible, as soon as it is safe, to be able to enter consciously into the inner worlds. Makes me feel like a dunce, but because I've been at it 50-some years and I'm still not consciously stepping into the inner worlds every night. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy is an evolutionary philosophy. It uses a spiral method of education. In the cosmoconception, it introduces the philosophy in very simple experiential terms, and then goes over them again and again in deeper and broader ways until it covers the entire solar creation, the whole manifestation. The Rosicrucian method is very strong on exercises. And all of the exercises are based on the principles behind the evolutionary creation. Which means that when we develop something, it isn't a specialized something that we can read our own past lives. It is a general understanding so that we can read anyone's past life. The perfect example of Rosicrucian exercise that is based on cosmic principle is retrospection. Retrospection is based on the principle that in the second half of the evolutionary creation, form starts going into decadence. And as it goes into decadence, we draw all of the soul material out of it and feed it into our spiritual consciousness until at the very end we are at last at one with, so to speak, God. And so that principle where every day we look back and review our lives, we're unwinding things. And when we unwind things, things dissolve. If we have any hang-ups in us, they get dissolved. And little by little, they're taken directly into the spirit, and we have immediate improvement in consciousness, and we don't have to wait for another rebirth before we can use the new consciousness. So the whole principle that is involved in retrospection, including the reverse direction of the memory, is exactly the way the evolutionary creation goes. The spirit winds itself into matter, and then it unwinds itself out of matter. And that's a very simplified statement of it. So the exercises are based on principles that are in the cosmos. We're told that even when there is initiation, the initiation is based on the principles of the cosmos. The first initiation, one relives in their own experience, their experience in the Saturn period, and in the Saturn revolution of the Earth period, and in the Polarian epoch. So, piece by piece, we have this great memory of everything that we've done in the creation, and that is part of the spiritual work. And so it's all based on the principles of the cosmos. So if we want to try to begin to understand the most rudimentary things about unconsciousness, it would behoove us to look at the process in the evolutionary creation. So that's what we're going to try to do. When we turn our attention to the preparatory and the early stages of our solar creation, as it is found in the Rosicrucian philosophy, we are not disappointed. We find things about consciousness and unconsciousness right from the very get-go, right from the very beginning. the second part of the cosmic conception. Part 2 is cosmogenesis, cosmogony. And it addresses our relationship to the creation. And that's done because we can comprehend that. If the cosmogony were discussed from the point of view of the archangels, we wouldn't understand a bit of it. It would be so different to our consciousness. So, it talks about the wave of the spirit. You can call it a life wave, or you can call it an evolutionary wave, but a wave within the fluidic spirit to which we all belong is our human life wave. And we, at the beginning of this, were virgin spirits, meaning to say that we had no previous experience of this kind of evolutionary work. Now there are two extremely important things about consciousness and unconsciousness in the very beginning of the cosmogony. The first statement is that the virgin spirits that are now our humanity were all consciousness. That's almost a word-for-word quote. The virgin spirits that are now our humanity were all consciousness. Now that's a pretty remarkable, we're all conscious. That's a pretty remarkable thing to say. But it's also something that is misunderstood. And most of the potential misunderstanding rests on one word, all. Part of the misunderstanding, or likely misunderstanding, is due to our limited materialistic consciousness. If someone says, I'm in this game for all of the marbles, we understand that person to mean that they want to win every marble that's in the circle. Consciousness is not like that. Consciousness, though it's absolute, we may not know all of its qualities. But being absolute consciousness is singular. There are not different consciousnesses. There are different states of consciousness, as we spoke about them last night. We talked about unconsciousness and subconsciousness and threshold consciousness, but it's still all one consciousness. It's analogous to the illustration that I gave last evening of being in a restaurant with a expert musical arranger. I heard all of the music. I heard the melody, I heard the harmonies, I heard the instruments and all of that, so I heard all of it. But I didn't hear all of the things within it. I didn't hear the balance, or I didn't hear the compositional techniques or things like that, because it wasn't there. This is the way it is with consciousness. We can be consciousness of the whole. We can be conscious of the whole. We can be conscious of that all. But that doesn't mean that we are conscious of everything in it. We're something like little children playing make-believe. We're in what we're doing totally, but we're not conscious of all the little details, or we're not conscious of the whole process. In the cosmic conception, we know there are other qualities of consciousness than simple all-consciousness. Because the text tells us that one of the purposes for the evolutionary creation is added self-consciousness. That's a direct quote. One of the purposes is added self-consciousness. The creation is to add to self-consciousness of the whole. This is a really difficult thing, you know. You can spend years on this. From this we can conclude that for God, or for the universal spirit, there was self-conscious all-consciousness. But there was the possibility of more. I don't know how to say it. God knows all that is, but does not know what isn't. And in some ways probably doesn't know everything that could be. So when there is, well, you know, it's always been attributed to God that it is all-knowing. But you can only know what is. You can't know what isn't. But there is always the possibility of something new. This is not some simple repetition that God is going through a rehearsal of a creation again and again. It's the same old, same old. That's not so. Because we know it from the first little spiritual experience that we have when we are in the Spirit, we know it's all new. We don't even have to have a full-blown spiritual experience. We read the Bible, we read the Cosmic Conception, we read a poetry book, and we read the same thing over, and each time it means something new. So it's something very, you know, it's live that way. It's new. I don't know how to say it any other way. So from this, it's possible to infer that within God there is virgin spirit consciousness that has all consciousness, but not all self-consciousness. When we're talking about the Spirit, we're not talking about peanuts or something like that. We're talking about something that has qualities that are extremely hard for us simpletons to understand. There are people who do fruitfully contemplate this, and it's always fruitful. I go back to it again and again and again, and it keeps me off the streets. And it's always satisfying. It's like that thing in Norse mythology where the heroes come into the feast room after they've been out doing their gallant works, and they eat, unfortunately they eat pig, but the pig is symbolical of wisdom. And every time Buddha was said to die of eating too much pork, and he was a vegetarian. I could go into a side trip on that, but it's too much. But you cut off the pig, and as soon as you cut off the slice, more is there. And it's like that with spiritual things. It's always satisfying. There's no end to it. So it's so much better to follow the Rosicrucian way of doing this, so that we can actually grow into and actually experience this. All right. Now the second extremely important thing about consciousness in this part of the Rosicrucian cosmoconception is that for the life wave of virgin spirits that now constitutes our current humanity, in order to become self-conscious as we are now, we had to be made, this is exactly the words, entirely unconscious. We could not become what we have become or what we will become if we had remained in all consciousness. I don't know if there would have been satisfaction in that or what, but we had to be made entirely unconscious. We had to be made entirely unconscious to waking self-consciousness. Now that's astounding. That's very profound if we could understand it. It's not to be confused with other dualities. There are a lot of people that believe you can't know good without having known evil. That's not so. You can know good, and in the process evil comes along the way, but good is good because it's good, and it's not good because it's contrary to evil. But consciousness, waking self-consciousness, it is necessary for it to experience unconsciousness before it can be awakened. Obviously, we could spend several lives, and probably we will be spending several lives contemplating this. They would be well-spent lives, but it's not something we're going to crack in an hour talk like this. We have within summer school, we have only 5 short talks, and that's not very much. The first thing that the relationship of all consciousness to unconsciousness demonstrates is simply that there are 2 kinds of consciousness. And they are both part of what could be called general consciousness, or just plain consciousness. It's not a matter of all consciousness being ejected from consciousness into some other state or some other reality that is called unconsciousness, only to be later called back and in some miraculous way be more self-conscious within waking consciousness. It's not a different state. It's not a different reality. There are 2 states of one reality. The universal spirit is one. Whether we are in the conscious part of it or in the unconscious part of it. General consciousness is one. Nothing exists outside of the universal spirit. It is being. There is no being without that universal being. Our dear friend Bobby Stevens, who is now departed from Detroit, used to say it so beautifully. He said, "There ain't nothing but God." And that's the truth of it. Now, another important thing about this is that there was some degree of waking consciousness before we became unconscious. That waking state is what we've been calling all conscious, or at least the Rosicrucian Cosmo concept calls it that. Now, this fact in itself tells us several important things. First, let's look at it in the ultimate, by taking it in the most absolutely simple case. That is to say, when there is consciousness and unconsciousness and nothing else. This means that there has always been consciousness. There has always been some kind of conscious awareness. It's not a matter that consciousness was at some time or some eternity born out of unconsciousness. There has always been some kind of consciousness. This does imply that consciousness can be extended, expanded, deepened, or in some other way modified or improved through unconsciousness, but it does not say that there was a time when there was not consciousness. Now this is hard to grasp with our minds because it is beyond the mind and it transcends the mind, and all we can do is sort of reflectively point. We're talking about eternal things. We're talking about boundless things, and we're talking about things of infinite potential. This merely says that there is eternal consciousness of some kind. We're trying to understand it with our objective waking self-consciousness, which is not very well developed. And that's not an easy thing to do, but this is nothing new. There are scriptural references to it in all religions. I think one of the most beautiful ones comes from the Apocalypse of St. John, where it says, quote, at least quotes the King James Version, from that which is and was and which is to come. Talking about that eternal conscious being. Now practically, this should assuage any of our insecurities and set us on the path of transcendental, eternal outlooks in thought. I say assuage because we have a lot of insecurities. And a good part of enlightenment is letting go from the things that we cling to. This is where a lot of fundamentalism comes from. People have wonderful experiences of the Holy Spirit and things like that, but they're still not secure. And so they hang on to a fundamentalism that's utterly stupid, even in the face of having the conscious spiritual experience. We can't let that happen to us. We have to be able to say, all right, I'll let go of my outlook now. We don't have to guard it or keep it in a closed fist or something like that, because we have the faith or we have the knowledge or we have the realization that it's not going to be lost. We're going to get it back in a much bigger sense. In fact, it's never lost. It's subsumed by a greater understanding. Now, let's take a little tiny exegesis that is not completely irrelevant, though hopefully it could awaken some insecurities that are even beyond clinging. Let's take a little step further about absolute simplicity. If it is possible for the universal spirit to plunge, using the word of Max Heindel, a wave of its being into unconsciousness, is it possible for it to plunge or give over its entire being into unconsciousness? It's a big question. And the Rosicrucian Cosmo-conception does not give an answer to that. Some mystical philosophies do. For example, Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine quotes the stanzas of Dizian, where she says, the eternal parent, wrapped in its ever-invisible robes, awakens from a sleep of seven eternities. Something like that, she said. That's only a paraphrase. I'm inclined to think that this is a possibility, because the Rosicrucian Cosmo-conception implies something like that when it says that just as there are periods of rest between each day, there are periods of rest between each creative day and between each creative manifestation. So it's conceivable that the whole business goes to sleep in a waking kind of sleep, in the same way that every part of it does. This is based on the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. It's called the principle of analogy. And we're told very clearly, especially if you are a probationary student to the Rosicrucian Order, you're told that you're supposed to be able to figure out many things about the spiritual world using the principle of analogy, and we are encouraged to do that. If we sleep, the solar creation sleeps in cosmic light nights. And it seems possible that the universal spirit sleeps. But if it sleeps, with what consciousness? Because we've said just now that there is always at some time consciousness. So I assume that there's something on a very high level, a consciousness that is awake even in what would be sleep from activity. But this is just a little side trip. As long as we don't say that there was a time or an eternity where there never was consciousness, something like this is philosophically agreeable. Let's look at another important thing about the fact that there was waking consciousness before we became unconscious. If we know this, we can keep from very serious errors and illusions which are the property of most people in the world. Even the most educated people, intelligent people in the world. If we look at evolution from the materialistic point of view, it is, they see, since they can only deal with the things of the senses, we are the highest product of evolution. We're it. We're at the top. We're king, so to speak. And we have a certain attitude about that that's rather vainglorious. And we feel that we have the prerogative to do whatever we will. You know, it's in the opening chapters of Genesis, it says, the animals are yours to take care of. So what do we do with our charges? We eat them. and beyond that, we think it's perfectly all right by our intelligent science to do vivisection and to use animals cruelly in experiments and things like that. That's what happens. That's a very practical thing that happens when you have the materialistic view of evolution. And one feature of that materialistic view is that evolution is blind. It gropes. And it's groping not towards some purposeful end, but at best to self-perpetuation and continuation, and not much more. And it all happens because of random events, no purposeful activity. With that kind of attitude, we think we can direct evolution wherever we want. Now, strictly speaking, that is a bottom-up view of things. Materialism is a bottom-up view of the world. And that leads to all kinds of impossibilities and illusions. One of those currently that you hear a lot is a pair of words that is in itself an oxymoron. Artificial intelligence. There's a belief in the artificial intelligence community that we will eventually produce a computer program that is more creatively intelligent than we are. At best, it would be something like Hal in that movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, that Stanley Kubrick movie. Now, this is, from the spiritual point of view, it is an impossibility. Something lesser can't create something greater. Max Heindel tells us repeatedly, you can't live in a body, you can't make a body better than they're creatively capable of. Through experience and getting back to the spirit again and again, you can make improvements, but you can't do something beyond yourself. A computer can do many brute force computations much faster than humans. But that's not how humans solve problems. A computer can store and have instant access to many, many facts more than humans can, at least within the brain memory. But that's not how we recognize things. A computer can recognize certain situations or certain patterns, such as a checkmate in chess. But that's not creative intelligence. Computer can even design new computers that are more efficient than the computers that the programs are running on. IBM has been doing that for decades. But a computer cannot produce a creative intelligence greater than the being that created the computer and the program running in it. We as humans solve problems by focused, intuitive, dead reckoning. We can raise our consciousness because it was elevated before we descended into unconsciousness. There never was a time without waking spiritual consciousness during manifestation. This is extremely important to us for spiritual awakening. It's said in sort of a klutzy way in the Bible. I don't mean to be criticizing the Bible, but the Bible says that to see God, you must believe that God is. The word belief is always difficult, and probably the better word would be to intuit. The existence of a timeless, pre-existent spirit would be better. We did something like that. We can awaken to higher states of consciousness all the way to all consciousness because we have been there. We were there in the first place. It's self-defeating to try to develop states of higher consciousness with the attitude that they were never present before. They've been there all along. All the while that we've been slogging along through unconsciousness, the spiritual worlds have been there and we've been through them. Maybe a simple example will help. Losing something. Suppose we lose our car keys. And that losing is a kind of unconsciousness. Now, if we're searching for them, if we have an attitude, if we accept the fact that they are lost and we have an attitude that they're lost, we're suggesting to ourselves a kind of negativity. And that closes us off to finding them. It's much better to have a psychological state where we're thinking found, where we anticipate, where we're going to remember the last time we had the keys, or where we're going to stumble on them where they were all along. This is something that's positive. This is something that is an attitude that opens our consciousness. So if we understand that we are high spiritual beings to begin with, the life of spiritual development is so much easier. We're not blocking ourselves with false attitudes. Now the plunge into unconsciousness, which the word plunge implies, it was sudden, continued a long while. It continued with our descent into matter. In the Rosicrucian philosophy, this descent into matter is called involution. That's where our word involved comes from. We became more involved in matter. That plunging is a projection of spirit into the unknown. Just like where the car keys are is an unknown to us. So the plunge is a projection into most likely a disorganized or unorganized or non-organized state. Now this is a top-down outlook as opposed to a bottom-up outlook. It's totally different. The evolutionary creation is in reality, when we look at it in its whole, it is both a top-down and a bottom-up. Because once we awaken self-consciousness in matter, we do return, and we do return from the bottom up. From materialism until we have full spiritual awakening. We'll address that eventually, but for now we have some other even more difficult questions to ask and answer. These are almost impossibly difficult questions to ask. This is why you read sometimes one sentence in the Cosmoconception, you can read it over again and again and again for a year. Because there are hard things to understand. The Cosmoconception is a really deceptive book. It's a deceptive book because Max Heindel is an extremely clear writer. And when you read what he says, it is so clear to your understanding as it is now that you think you know it. And in reality, you probably don't know it. And what's even more difficult about it is the fact that we intuit the truth of it, and with that intuiting the truth, we know that in general that this is true, but we don't realize that in specific and in all of the important details of it, we really don't know it. Like some of these things here I have pondered over hours and hours, and these are almost impossible questions. So, what this talk is, it's very far from an accomplished or a perfect or a final talk. It's meant to invite thinking about things that we've taken for granted when we've gone over these words. You know, it's to stimulate us to do our homework, because it does come down to simple things in life. The how this all comes about is very difficult, and why this all comes about is even more difficult. How were we as virgin spirits made entirely unconscious? Those are the words to quote the Cosmo. If a prize fighter knocks out his opponent, he has rendered that opponent unconscious. If one is anesthetized for a surgery, one is so unconscious that even the most painful things are not felt. If one falls into a very deep sleep, one is close to being entirely unconscious. Now, the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception describes becoming unconscious as being plunged into matter, which at that time was only as dense as a concrete thought. Eddie showed that very clearly this afternoon. But that was enough to take us completely away from our all-consciousness. Right now, most of us would be happy to be in the world of concrete thought, or the subdivision of the mind, of the world of thought that is concrete. Now, none of these examples, the prize fighter or anesthetization, none of those examples are appealing. The reason is that all of these examples involve coercive, involuntary means. According to the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, the creative impulse was a fiat. The original word in the beginning was a command. It was a command that brought things into being. But because something is a fiat does not preclude freedom. An undeniable argument or an unconditional love has an impelling power. It's as powerful as a fiat, but neither overpowers our will, and neither takes away our freedom. We have to be free to create. We have to be free to learn things. We have creativity. In the Rosicrucian philosophy, we're told that one of the goals for us, our life wave, is to develop a completely creative mind so that we can produce new creative minds. So we have to be free to create. So the way that we have been plunged into unconsciousness is not something that is overpowering or overwhelming. It has to be based on, and it has to be imbued with freedom. Freedom, like consciousness, has been there from the beginning. Now from this it seems reasonable that going into or taking on unconsciousness had to have had some kind of voluntary part to it. And it was not involuntary coercion. So corresponding to all consciousness, which we tried to understand earlier, there must be an all freedom that even though we don't choose to take this route or that route in a specific way that we do in this world, that's a specific kind of freedom, there had to be some kind of freedom or we wouldn't participate. And there had to be some kind of freedom or there wouldn't have been dropouts from the very beginning. Not dropouts, but stragglers. So freedom is always there. Freedom doesn't come at the end. It is we awake to a freedom that's been there all the while, and it is much enhanced for our getting back to it. If that is true, it's fine, but it still doesn't give us an answer of how we came into unconsciousness. Again, it seems reasonable to me that we were presented in spirit with an engaging mystery, or an opportunity to sacrifice in some kind of unconditioned or unconditional love that we couldn't pass up, because to do so would have been out of the nature of spirit, virgin spirit. Seen in this way, unconsciousness is a state of unknown. And the unknown is something like a mystery, or something like a creative problem to a painter. Those are very specific examples. Or something very potent with possibility, something very pregnant with possibility. There may be other attributes of spirit in the accepting of unconsciousness, but these are sufficient to open the door to begin to see how with regard to unconsciousness. This also brings us a little bit closer to answering that impossibly difficult why. This not only implies that there is not only a mystery in the unknown, in the unconsciousness, but also something that changes everything. This is really, really important. Becoming unconscious in this way changed everything. I can't say it more emphatically than that. If it was necessary for us to become unconscious, to becoming waking, objective, self-conscious creators, there has to be something in unconsciousness that changes the game altogether. Something totally new, something totally unprecedented. This is something that is utterly irrevocable and utterly changes us forever. Now, this is a difficult pill to swallow if you are a truth seeker. If you're a truth seeker, you follow the final words of Goethe on his deathbed. Light, more light. And if we are told that we have to go into the darkness of unconsciousness before we can self-consciously seek light, that's a tough thing to take on. That's a really, really hard thing as a human being. This bitter pill has been around for a long time. And a lot of stupendous spiritual thinkers have dealt with it. In ancient Greece, and ancient Greece was the dividing point in time and space between the East and the West. In Greece, both science and rational spirituality began to develop. And there have been none more brilliant in that, at that time, than the Orphics. Pythagoras, Plato, Plotinus, all of them, marvelous, marvelous consciousness they had. But for all of their brilliance, they didn't know how to deal with the value of matter and of unconsciousness, which they pretty much, like we're seeing in this in this talk, are pretty close to equivalent. Like the Eastern mysticism before them, they were almost completely top-down thinkers. And that being the case, they abhorred having to go into matter. Plato teaches that it was a punishment, and to go into unconsciousness was a horrible, horrible thing. So this is a problem that's really been around for a long time. And these are people who knew a lot. For example, they had the divine spirit represented the good, and the life spirit represented the beautiful, and the human spirit represented the truth, which still applies to this day. And to some extent, they understood that the chemical region of the physical world was the inverse reflective projection of the divine spirit, of the good. But they weren't willing to accept matter as good. So humanity and even the initiates were not ready for concepts like we find in the Rosicrucian cosmoconception. Even if they were, it was of much lesser importance than waking consciousness or getting back to the spiritual worlds without carrying out the responsibility to glean as much of as many different kinds of experiences as possible. Because we're here, we're like ants in some ways. We're supposed to the evolutionary creation takes us through so many different kinds of experiences, and from each of them a different facet of the spirit comes out, and that's what our work is. We're supposed to come back home with all kinds of understanding. We're not just supposed to say, hey, I want to get out of here, this is unpleasant. There's no creative greatness in that. So they were not ready for some of the modern concepts of evolution. Even if they were, it was of much less importance. This attitude was so prevalent. I love the Neoplatonists. I've read many volumes of the Neoplatonists, especially Plotinus. I love them. I read Plotinus in 3 different translations. It took me 5 years to go through it. It's like a secret doctrine in abstract thinking. But a lot of the Neoplatonists considered matter evil. Not even just an illusion, but evil. It was the inverse of the good. And it was something to be eschewed, not something to be overcome, or not something to be transformed, or not something to be eaten up and changed into food for the spirit. They didn't see things that way. So one extreme begot another, and in philosophical history, the thinkers followed the lead of Aristotle, who was not an initiate, into materialism. And the plunge into deep, dark materialism in the Western world continues even to our times. It could even be considered a material idolatry. You could call it a matter-olatry or something like that. Though extremist, it's not without evolutionary purpose. So we need to understand what matter or a state of matter is. Now, from the viewpoint of the modern mysteries, the Rosicrucian mysteries included, matter is something like a congealed ignorance. In a creative manifestation, the universal spirit, as one and collectively through the hierarchy, projects a creative scheme, a creative plan, a creative dream, a scenario, if you want to call it that, into the unknown. And the unknown, in Rosicrucian terminology, we're back at our old friend again, is the absolute. The absolute is everything that is, everything that isn't, and we don't know. It's beyond anything known. That's where the mystery is. When the dream enters into the potential of what could be, what happens is like what happens with any projection. When you project something, you produce a field that draws something around it. And matter is that congealed field that is around the projection of the creative impulse. So, it's like saying when somebody knows something, one senses a whole lot that one doesn't know. And the more that the knowing gets projected into those things that we now see we don't know, the more they become, I don't want to say crystallized, but the more they become clear until finally we understand them. And we take them into the known. And the taking them into the known is the process of producing a new waking consciousness. So, in all of this, we're engaged. We're fascinated. That's how we get plunged. We get plunged into a mystery, like reading a mystery novel, and we're intrigued. It's much more glorious than all of that. It's kind of almost sacrilegious to put it in such terms. But it is an irresistible struggle to know. Goethe called it the eternal feminine leading us on. That's the way he ends Faust, saying that there is this that draws us into it. So in this struggle, the soul material is formed, it is absorbed and assimilated into the spirit, and new consciousness is born. New consciousness is born from the potential, from the unconscious that is in the Absolute. This takes place on every level, from the Supreme Being to grains of sand rubbing against each other on the seashore. It's same thing all the way through. It's a real struggle. Reality is real because, how do you say it? Life is alive in manifestation because the world fights back. If it were all just a daydream, in a daydream you can do whatever you want. But in reality, things fight back. And that's what proves it. In that is where our divinity comes into being. We say, I'm going to be an altruist and I'm going to love everyone. And along comes somebody who has just the thing that gets our goat. And right then and there, the altruism goes down the drain. And so everything in the creation is a struggle. This is not a hateful struggle. It's not a war or anything like that. It's probably best won by loving our adversary or loving whatever is our trial, whatever it is that needs to be healed. It's not only that we need to begin with the most rudimentary and fundamental consciousness that we pass through these early states. It's necessary that we come that close to the total unknowing, or what Max Heindel says, utter unconsciousness or complete unconsciousness, which is why we're plunged into the unconscious. It's the very nature of spirit to give and create. Even as virgin spirit. It is the life spirit comes out of the virgin spirit. The divine spirit comes out of the virgin spirit. The life spirit is unconditional love. So the unconditional love had to be there in some virgin state in the virgin spirit. Geez, I almost sound like a minister. Eddie is saying, it's my dad all over again. Oh, wow.
You need a more sturdy pulpit.
Yeah, I also start pounding my fist in my hand or something like that. So, we love. And it's not dissimilar. To me, seeing a person suffer in a hospital is not as bad as seeing a drunk or seeing somebody that's insane. But at least the person in the hospital can ask and say, why is this happening to me? And then if they listen when they ask that question, they'll get an answer. But the poor drunk or the pure insane person is in such a position that they can't know. The fifth house rules both love and education. We love our children, we educate them. And that's part of the fascination that draws us into the Absolute. That is how we get plunged. It's not with the same kind of consciousness that we have as human beings, because the all consciousness of Virgin Spirit is something much different. But this is, I think, a simple way of trying to understand that. Now, hopefully, this gives us some little understanding of the mystery and the value of unconsciousness. How it relates to creation, which is one of the primary attributes of divinity. It's an absolute thing. In the coming talks, we're going to talk about much simpler things and much more commonplace things, but somehow before going into that, we had to understand that there is something fundamentally important about unconsciousness, and the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception teaches us that very beautifully, even though we may not fully understand it. After this talk, we still might not understand it. All right. We'll close with the Rosicrucian prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Thank you.
Well, the talk was a success. Nobody walked out.